Okay, let's dive into one of the most cataclysmic events in all of ancient history. This is a story that ends with a mystery that has seriously puzzled people for more than 2,500 years. So, for 4 whole centuries, Solomon's temple was the absolute center of Israel's world. Now, we're not just talking about a building. To them, this was the place where heaven literally touched the earth. It was this structure of just unbelievable glory. We're talking cedar from Lebanon, walls shimmering with pure gold. And then it was gone. In the summer of 586 BC, the Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, reduced 400 years of sacred history to nothing but ash and rubble. The destruction was total. Now, you have to understand, the Babylonians were meticulous. Their records list every single golden spoon, every silver bowl. They even counted the little decorative pomegranates on the pillars. And yet, the one thing, the most sacred object of all, the Ark of the Covenant, it's just not on the list. So the question is, where was it? To solve that mystery, we actually have to back up a bit and understand why the temple was destroyed in the first place. And the reason you'll see isn't just military, it's theological. See, the people of Judah had fallen into this really dangerous superstition. They started to believe the physical temple building was like a magic charm that would protect them no matter what they did. They'd chant, "The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." But the prophet Jeremiah, he warned them that God saw the reality behind the facade, a nation drowning in idolatry and injustice, a nation that had ignored every single warning. And this brings us to God's chosen instrument for this judgment. Enter Nebuchadnezzar. He's not just some pagan emperor. The Bible gives him this shocking title, my servant. Not because he worshipped the God of Israel, he definitely didn't, but because he was the tool being used to carry out a divine verdict. So the stage is set. Judah's king, Zedekiah, makes an absolutely fatal political mistake. He breaks his sworn oath to Babylon and decides to side with Egypt instead. And with that, the countdown to destruction officially begins. In January of 588 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's massive army surrounds Jerusalem, cutting it off. For a little while, there's this glimmer of hope. The Egyptian army shows up, and the Babylonians actually pull back. But Jeremiah had already told them what would happen. The Egyptians would turn tail and go home. And he was right. The Babylonians returned, and the siege resumed. For 18 agonizing months, the city was slowly strangled. No food in, no people out. You have to understand, this wasn't a quick battle. This was a slow, brutal, grinding process of starvation. The conditions inside those walls became, well, unspeakable. The Book of Lamentations, which is an eyewitness account, gives this horrific detail. And that's not a metaphor. It's the grim, tragic reality of ancient siege warfare. A specific curse, by the way, that Moses had warned about centuries earlier if the people broke their covenant. And in the final, chaotic days, as the city finally fell, the personal tragedy of Judah's last king, Zedekiah, played out in the most horrifying way imaginable. As the walls were breached, Zedekiah and his men tried to flee, but they were captured on the plains of Jericho. And the tragic irony here is just staggering. Jericho, the very site of Israel's first great victory when they entered the Promised Land, is now the site of their final, humiliating defeat. Years before any of this happened, the prophet Ezekiel had given this very strange, almost contradictory prophecy about King Zedekiah. How could you be taken to Babylon but never actually see the city? It doesn't seem to make sense. Well, the fulfillment of that prophecy was just brutal. First, Nebuchadnezzar forced Zedekiah to watch as his own sons were executed right in front of him. Then, his eyes were gouged out. The very last thing he ever saw was the death of his royal line. He was then dragged in chains to Babylon, blind. The prophecy was fulfilled, down to the last horrifying letter. About a month later, Nebuchadnezzar's top guy, a man named Nebuzaradan, his title was basically chief executioner, arrived in the city. His job wasn't to fight, it was to systematically dismantle and loot everything. This wasn't random chaos, this was organized demolition. The iconic, massive bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz, were smashed into pieces for easier transport. The giant bronze sea, a basin that sat on 12 bronze oxen, was shattered. And every single sacred cup, bowl, and pan made of gold and silver was carefully cataloged and carried off to Babylon. And the level of detail is just astounding.
The scribes actually counted 96 individual pomegranates that were carved into the tops of the pillars. Think about that. This obsessive accounting is what makes the one missing item so glaring. If they counted the pomegranates, there is no way they would have missed the Ark of the Covenant.
So, here we are, back at our central question. If the Babylonians didn't take it, and they definitely would have, what happened to the Ark? Well, the answer isn't about what men did, but about what God had already done. And here it is. This is the crucial point of the whole story. The Ark wasn't on the Babylonian inventory list because the divine presence it represented was no longer there. The Ark's value, its holiness, was tied to God's glory, and that glory had already departed. The prophet Ezekiel, who was already in exile in Babylon, had this incredible vision. He saw the glory of God, this brilliant divine presence, literally get up, rise from between the cherubim, pause at the temple door as if it was reluctant to leave, and then slowly depart from the city. God vacated his own house before the enemy ever laid a hand on it. And that, right there, changes everything. The destruction of the temple wasn't a victory for Babylon's gods over the God of Israel. It was the God of Israel himself, using a pagan empire to enact the very covenant curses that he had warned about for centuries. But here's the amazing part. Even in this overwhelming act of judgment, God made sure to preserve what mattered most. Not the stone building, but a remnant of his people. Not all the gold, but the specific sacred vessels, which were kept safe in Babylon and would one day return. The kingdom fell, but the promise of a future king did not. This whole story, it just pulls back the curtain on a fundamental truth. The fire burned the gold and the stone, but the symbol of God's presence, the Ark, was gone long before the first flame was lit. Which tells you that God's true treasure was never the physical temple or its golden artifacts. So the real question it leaves us with is, what was it then? What does he truly value?